As we know, Yom Kippur is a time for introspection, a moment for reflection, and an opportunity for confession. This Yom Kippur, as I have engaged in the process of Cheshbon HaNefesh, the accounting of my soul, and have considered my thoughts and actions over the past year, I feel compelled to share a confession with you. I am angry. I'm angry at the pervasive and systemic racism that so many ignore or dismiss, including, as we recently learned, the fact that the killers of Breonna Taylor will face no accountability for their actions. I'm angry that there is still a significant percentage of people in this country who refuse to take the simple step of wearing a mask to help us all stay as safe and healthy as possible, even as the death toll from the coronavirus pandemic passes 200,000 people. I'm angry at the blatant and callous hypocrisy exhibited by many politicians who so quickly and easily cast aside the values they claim to cherish in order to maintain power and control. I'm angry at the increased efforts to deny people the right to vote as a means of quashing the legitimate voice of the citizens of this country. I am angry that immigrant children are still in cages. I am angry that women's bodies are still subject to government interference. I am angry that social media companies intentionally sow discord to make a profit. I'm angry that climate change still isn't being adequately addressed. And I'm angry that anti-Semitism isn't taken as seriously as it should be by those who claim to be against prejudice in all its forms. And I know I am not alone in my anger. I think a lot of us are dealing with similar feelings. And I'm willing to bet that many of us also have a certain level of discomfort with the anger we are feeling. Perhaps we feel that since things are going okay for us personally, being angry conveys a lack of awareness of or gratitude for our relative good fortune. Maybe we think that feeling angry is unproductive and that we should seek to replace our anger with a better or healthier emotion. Or maybe we have been influenced by the many pop culture sources that paint anger as a negative and something to be avoided. And if we're being honest, this idea is imposed upon women way more than men. Whatever the reason may be, many of us find ourselves in the position of feeling angry and simultaneously trying to deny or suppress that anger. And maybe we should. When we look to Jewish sources, we find a wide variety of texts that view expressing or even just feeling anger as anywhere from ill-advised to a fatal character flaw. One of the concepts that informs this negative attitude towards anger is the idea that we should strive to emulate God, who is described in the well-known verse from Exodus that we hear at the beginning of the Torah service as erech apayim, slow to anger. And were we to still be unclear about whether we should cultivate this characteristic in ourselves, we get the verse from Proverbs that teaches, better to be slow to anger than mighty, to have self-control than to conquer a city. The sages of the Talmud pick up on this idea of anger as a negative trait and expand upon it. In the tractate or section called Pesachim, we read, there are three people the Holy One loves, one who does not get angry, one who does not get drunk, and one who does not stand on ceremony. And then taking it even further, we read in tractate Shabbat the teaching, one who rends his garments in anger, or who breaks his vessels in anger, or who scatters his money in his anger, should be like an idol worshiper in your eyes. An idol worshiper. The sages are comparing getting angry with one of the worst things a Jewish person can do, something that is in fact a capital offense. Not to be outdone, Maimonides, the great scholar and philosopher of the 12th century, makes the case that we should not only resist showing any anger, but that even feeling it without expressing it is problematic and something to be avoided. Anger is an extremely evil tendency, he says, and it is proper for one to remove oneself from it to the other extreme. One should teach oneself not to get angry, even over a matter which befits anger. All of these texts, as well as many others, view the expression of anger as an inherently negative and even sinful act, and as such dictate that we, no matter the roots of our anger, no matter whether if it is justified or not, should do whatever is necessary to jettison these feelings. And they have a point. Anger is often compared to fire, and just like we have seen how destructive fire can be when not strictly controlled, so too can anger burn out of control until we are consumed by it. But fire can, of course, be used in positive ways as well. Fire can keep us warm, cook our food, give us light. Fire, through the lighting of candles, is an integral part of our Shabbat, Havdalah, and holiday observances. So too do we find within our tradition the idea that anger can serve as a positive when properly harnessed. Interestingly, one of the same arguments used to frame anger as a negative can be used to the opposite effect as well. We read in the first story of creation in Genesis that we are created B'Tselem Elohim, in the image of God. And one of the ways this can be understood is that we share characteristics with God. So earlier I mentioned that the idea of emulating God being slow to anger as an example of this, but even a cursory look through our Torah and the Hebrew Bible as a whole reveals numerous examples of God getting angry. I mean, come on, the whole period that the Israelites are wandering in the desert is basically just a steady stream of stories about God getting mad at the Israelites for one thing or another. We also see God's anger referenced repeatedly in the books of the prophets, as in this verse from Nahum. He says, "Who can stand before God's wrath? Who can resist God's fury? Adonai's anger pours out like fire, and rocks are shattered because of it." If this is the God in whose image we are created, then contrary to the thinking of the sages, it would seem that perhaps we are predisposed to anger, and that our expression of it is actually a natural part of our quest to emulate God. But here's where Abraham Joshua Heschel comes to make an important point about God's anger, and in doing so grants us insight into the role anger should play in our own lives. He teaches, quote, "The anger of God is not a blind, explosive force operating without reference to the behavior of humanity, but rather voluntary and purposeful, motivated by concern for right and wrong." So this idea of the intentionality of God's anger is also reflected in a commentary from the great French commentator Rashi on a verse from Ecclesiastes that reads, "Tov ka'as mischok," better anger than levity. Rashi comments that, quote, "It would have been better for the generation of the flood," from the Noah story, "if Adonai had shown them an angry countenance because of their sins, rather than the laughter God laughed with them. For had God shown them a slight expression of displeasure, they would have returned to do good." So what these commentaries teach us then is that anger is not necessarily a terrible sin on par with idolatry, but rather can be justified or even preferable in certain circumstances. And what might those circumstances be? I believe our Haftarah portion from the book of Isaiah speaks to this when it says, quote, "Is not this the fast I have chosen, to unlock the shackles of injustice, to loosen the ropes of the yoke, to let the oppressed go free, and to tear every yoke apart? Surely it is to share your bread with the hungry, and to bring the homeless poor into your house." These are the kind of values that, by Heschel's understanding, motivate God's anger. And they are the same kinds of values that should motivate ours. Turning to the fire analogy one last time, we should not let our anger rage like a wildfire, destroying indiscriminately. But nor should our anger be like the flame of a candle, burning slowly, methodically, but eventually consuming us all the same. Rather, we should seek to be like the burning bush, for as we read in Exodus, there was a bush all aflame, yet the bush was not consumed. We must burn with anger against hate. Let anger inflame our passion for justice, but we must ensure that we remain unconsumed, that our anger does not turn to hate, that our passion does not drive us to our own injustices. Then, like Moses, we can hear the voice of God compelling us forward as catalysts for change, for freedom, for redemption. Shana Tova, Gamar Chatima Tova.